Hello, welcome to Calumet Roundtable. I am your host, Lee Artz. I teach media studies here at Purdue Calumet. Today I'm joined by two guests, two faculty from Valparaiso University. My first is Elizabeth Wuerffel, Liz. She earned her MFA at Columbia College in Chicago, and she teaches digital media and video in the interdisciplinary arts and media department. Is that right?
In the art department.
Okay, and my other guest is Allison Schuette. She's got an MFA from Pennsylvania State University and teaches creative writing in the English department. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Today we're going to talk about personal stories, connecting personal stories to the university, to building community, to issues of social significance. And Valparaiso has this program called Welcome Project, where you do first-person interviews with, I guess, new students. Is that? Maybe you can explain a little bit.
Sure. We started the project about 5 years ago, and initially it was a project that was centered on campus with students, but it's since grown to include faculty, staff, and now community members. And this spring we've just launched an expansion to Lake County as well.
So you're doing the whole region?
Doing the whole region.
Okay. And how does the project work? Do you put a camera in your backpack and go somewhere, or you just stop somebody on the street? What's the process of choosing who gets interviewed?
Yeah, people can, from our website, request to be interviewed. Mostly, though, if we teach it as an assignment in one of our courses, our students will be selecting people they'd like to interview based on oftentimes who they know, but also who they think would have an interesting story to tell about belonging or not belonging. That's sort of the heart of the program or the project. And we also often get names of people that when folks hear about what we're doing, they're like, oh, you should really talk to. And so we'll often reach out to that person, ask them if they'd be interested, tell them a little bit about the project, and then we'll set up the interview. We don't have an official studio, but we do have a favorite location where we like to do our video
interviews. Come this way, I'll give you a piece of candy. I wanted to.
And we have
Is this outdoors?
Or is no, indoors. And we have a lot of audio as well. It's not just video.
So I understand the concept if it started as students. So did you primarily interview students from other countries that were new to the United States, so you were trying to find their experience? What was the impetus?
The impetus was, Valparaiso had sent me to Beijing to teach 3 semesters in a row, and I was teaching Chinese students who came to Beijing and then would matriculate into our graduate and undergraduate programs. So this was like a bridge program for them. And so when I got back to VU, I knew a lot of Chinese students, obviously. And one week, I had 2 stories in 1 week. So one from a Chinese student who talked about walking down the road late at night and being harassed by a car that drove up. And then the second story from an American student who talked about living in what she dubbed the international dorm and going down to do the laundry and having to deal with those Asians and their greasy, noodly, messy food. Wasn't happy. Yeah, so 2 stories in 1 week. I thought, okay, this seems important as a way to initially to assess the climate on campus. But then it grew very quickly to be more than a climate assessment. It was really an oral history project that started.
So did the climate change? And is that why you stopped testing the climate?
Oh, we haven't stopped testing.
No,
okay.
We still use it as a climate test sometimes.
Do you team teach? I mean, is this a class that's in English or in media arts?
No, actually, though, we would love to do that at some point. Right now, it's been something I've primarily worked in as an assignment in one of my creative nonfiction classes. But at some point, we'd love to have a course that was just focused on the Welcome Project.
How is that going to work? I'm in your class. I don't want to be in the international dorm. But you're going to give me an assignment to interview somebody that I'm not necessarily happy that they're here, or I'm only going to interview somebody that I want their voice to be heard? Is the question?
Yeah, I think, I spend a lot of time in the course first asking students to think about difference and what makes difference so challenging for us. Like when we encounter someone who is different than us, why do we often have the immediate reaction of pushing that away or making fun of it? So I think before students ever get around to interviewing other students, they've thought about the challenges of diversity and difference and how could we have different responses? Why could we have a response of curiosity as opposed to defensiveness? So I think that helps in terms of the students realizing that they're going not to try to prove something about a type of person that they may interview, but just to actually listen and ask them from their own shoes, what does it feel like to be this person that you are? And students usually are surprised to learn that, I don't know, even people that appear different than them are not
that different.
Not that different. Or the differences make us interesting to each other.
And sometimes the assumptions we go into, I'm going to interview you because you must have a story about X, Y, and Z, are not the stories that come out as the most important stories. So that's been a nice surprise, I think, for everyone involved too, that our assumptions are sometimes wrong.
Go ahead.
We have wanted to capture stories, though, of people who feel resistant. Like the point of the project is that we can use these individual stories in conversations with each other to really examine wherever we're at. So we do have some stories that are people talking about being labeled racist and what it feels like to have been labeled that way, and rejecting that label. So yeah, we do want the stories to capture just wherever you're at. It doesn't have to be a certain kind of story.
And why do you want to do that? Why do you want to capture where people are at the moment? I mean, is it an attempt to research what is public attitudes towards U.S. bombing Syria because this is where people are at, or is it just idle curiosity that there's all these strange people that are at? I mean, why do you want to know that answer to that question?
Well, for me, it's about change.
Okay.
Like, you can't change if you don't recognize where you're starting from.
Okay.
So, and I also feel like part of what makes conversations about diversity and inclusion really challenging at times is that you aren't sure that your initial response is valuable or is okay. And so if you get to hear somebody else be in a place you've been before, it gives you permission to just occupy that and be like, okay, this is, like, I don't have to change this. I can understand where I'm at, and then I can make decisions about when somebody else's experience is different than mine, what does that tell me about who I want to be?
I also think it makes, well, I mean, what is exciting to me is how complex people become when you just sit back and listen and know the questions to ask. Allison's a great interviewer, so.
She should be doing this.
Maybe
I'll give her the mic.
But that, I mean, I think in an hour and in an hour and a half, which is about how long our interviews run, you can find out a lot about a person. And this goes back to maybe what I was saying earlier about assumptions. We come in with certain assumptions based on how people look, how they talk, all sorts of things. And the deeper you get into the story, the more you realize that those assumptions can be troubled. So I think about how much I've gained through the stories myself as a participant in listening. And then I think what we try to do with those hour and a half stories is really boil down to the nugget or the diamond that's in there. How quickly can we get at that and then be able to then turn around and use that story
I was
for
going to ask you that a
facilitation.
minute ago. Who determines what the diamond is? You said, what's the important part of the story?
Yeah.
Who determines that? The interviewer, the person that's watching the videotape of it, or the person that's actually being interviewed? I mean, it seems it would be possible a person being interviewed, like I'm asking you questions. I may be asking the wrong questions, and you really want to talk about this. Well, what prevents, who decides this in your project?
Yeah, I mean, I think it happens on all levels along the way. So the interview is critical in that, because I think if you don't open up a space where people can talk from their own experience and their own interests, then you won't ever get at that. And then I think if you're in media, you know when people get excited about something, you can see it through them and you can hear it in their voice. So I think that we often find that those moments, even if they weren't what I thought would be interesting at the beginning, become the important part, the seed of that story.
Students who have played the role of editor, like when they're working with the interview that they've done, they've talked a lot about that responsibility and how nervous it makes them.
Don't want to cut out something that was important.
Yeah. So how do you listen to an interview that you've been through to try to understand what that person was trying to tell you, so that then you can locate that nugget?
It seems to me, not having done this outside of this show, but it seems to me there's at least three positions that you could talk about. One is the position of the interviewer that's interviewing somebody, either because it's an assignment or because they think that you're interesting or want to prove a point, right? So you've got, and you can have some control over that as the instructor. The other position is the position of the person that's being interviewed. What do they want to say? What do they want to express? And then the third is the public, whatever size it is, that actually sees the interview after it's been edited. So when you said you do this for change, all three of those positions you're interested in changing? Or primarily changing the position of the interviewers so that they're more tolerant of diversity, or changing the position of their interviewees so that they feel that their voice is heard?
Yeah.
What change are you talking about?
All three.
Okay, okay, we're going to commercial.
And the role of the editor.
Okay.
No, I do think, I've never had it phrased that way to me before, so that's very interesting, because I do think that the interviewee, I don't know about change, if that's the right word. Like, I'm not trying to change that person, but we have heard from people who have interviewed with us that having their story valued has made an impact on them and allowed them to claim that experience and see that it could be useful for other people, makes it even more valuable to them, especially if it's been a difficult experience.
Okay. You've raised a question that I've been grappling with for a while about the value of the interview. It's so big, I think we're going to go to break and we'll come back afterwards, because I want to talk about both the question of change and the question of the value of the interviewee. We're going to take a quick break. This is Calumet Roundtable. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I teach media studies here at Purdue. And today I'm joined with two guests from Valparaiso University, Liz Wuerffel and Allison Schuette. Right before we went to break, I was going to ask you a question, but before I get to that, I thought it might be helpful to update what's happened with the Welcome Project, because it started on campus. I understand now you're going to the outer regions of Lake County, including at Gary. And I thought maybe you could tell us where the project is at now, and maybe even talk a little bit about the process. You began to talk about where you did the interviews, so maybe you could say, Liz, how did you end up in Gary, and what are you trying to do with the interviews there?
Sure. So it came naturally out of some of the interviews we had collected from students who were from Gary, but then also from local residents who were part of the white flight from Gary in the 1960s and 70s. As we had more interviews, actually it was with Mayor Costas was one of our first, the mayor of Valparaiso.
Okay.
And he shared a story of growing up in Gary, and his parents also moved out in 1969 or something. Early on.
Yeah.
And so that story became one of a number of stories that has taken us into Lake County. So it's really a thread that we're finding is pulling us in that direction. And so that's been a real interest of ours in the last year. And then this spring, we just started our first interviews with Gary residents and also with people in Porter County or other places in Lake County who grew up in Gary.
Can I just add to that too? Because I think for me, when we did the Welcome Project on campus and we started using some of the stories in presentations and workshops, we created one that we were taking into the city of Valparaiso to share with civic organizations. And part of our desire to do those presentations was to have the conversation about when a community is experiencing demographic change, which is definitely happening at the university right now because we are trying to enlarge our student population from 4,000 to 6,000, and a lot of that will happen through international students or American students of color. And that's a shift for a predominantly white institution. And when we did the city presentation, we also looked at US Census data for Valparaiso and Porter County. And while neither the city nor the county are having as dramatic a demographic change as the university is, it is happening. I mean, it's nationally happening. And so to look at how, to look at how the city and the region or the county are changing, and wanting people to be able to see that as an opportunity as opposed to something to dread. And I just kept thinking about the history of this region in terms of Lake County and Porter County. And as somebody who didn't grow up here but went to school here and then came back here to teach, like that history is very much still alive for people. And I think people are very tender around it. And I just wanted people in Valparaiso to be able to say, instead of, well, I hope we don't become another ... I wanted them to think about, like, how could we start engaging each other as neighbors that are interested in each other's well-being and can be curious about each other. So for me, going into Gary is a way to start those conversations.
The people you're going to interview in Gary will be primarily black citizens.
No.
Okay.
We're hoping, actually, one of the things we've already learned is that even it's not a black and white, although I still feel like so many of our stories will probably make that seem like it's such the reality for the region.
Well, it was white flight. It wasn't, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't.
But we've learned that there's a Latino population, a Hispanic population, Puerto Rican population. So I think we're going to find some stuff there that we didn't expect. But we're also interviewing white residents who stayed, families who stayed in Gary. So we wanted to be a holistic kind of capture of the experience of white flight, regardless of your own racial background.
And you said before that your reason, well, Allison did. She can't speak for you, but one of the reasons to do this is because you're interested in change. And what I'm hearing here is that you want a different experience for the way people will respond to demographic change or economic change. How is that supposed to happen through the interview process? You go to Gary and you interview a white family or a black family. How does that process of interviewing contribute to a change that you're hoping for or seeking?
Well, I think it happens, what I see happening is it happens in the interview for the interviewee and the interviewers, and it also happens the way we use the stories after we edit them. So I think for the interviewees, what we've been finding is that most of them haven't thought about their childhood. I mean, I don't go around every day thinking about my childhood, so having questions that prompt that gets us back into that space where we grew up. And what we're finding is that the neighborhoods that they grew up in were so important, and the fabric of that neighborhood was so strong that that's something that they miss to this day. So with some of the interviews, we've only interviewed 7 or 8 people so far on this expansion project, but out of those interviews, everyone consistently says the neighborhood was so important to my development as a person. And then
was the neighborhood a segregated neighborhood, an integrated neighborhood?
Often ethnic neighborhoods. So
but definitely segregated.
Segregated,
really...
yeah. And then the schools might be the place where it was integrated. So they would have this experience of the neighborhood and then also the schools.
Again, it speaks to my question of what change is desired.
Yeah.
And I understand the change isn't actually in the interview, although it may be for those two people. But
Right.
when Gary Works laid off 27,500 people, I was a steel worker, 27,500 people, that's not going to be corrected with 27,500 interviews, which you couldn't complete in your lifetime anyway.
Yeah.
So what I hear you saying is the interview then gets publicized or shared with others, and we can have this larger conversation.
Yeah, so we
Yes.
have a website where we put the stories. We
And
have
the
about
website is?
120 stories on the website.
Okay.
It's welcomeproject.valpo.edu. And
Welcome Project,
welcomeproject.valpo.edu.
Okay.
And you can find about 110 of the stories there. We're backlogged. But we continue to put the stories up there. And then what we have used is a facilitation process that comes out of the Center on Civic Reflection, which is directed by Elizabeth Lynn. And that's a process where it's a series of questions that you ask, that clarifying questions and interpretive questions that get at the heart of the storyteller's experience and help the listeners and the participants in that conversation get into the shoes of that storyteller and then reflect back on their own lives through their work or service or community life about what it means to have heard that story and how does that fit in with their worldview or life view.
And what implications does it have for them and for their community? So I think one of the things that we've done these kinds of conversations already in numerous venues on campus, but one of the hopes we have for the project moving into Gary is that these can become community conversations. And then I think a lot of it will have to do with having this conversation in the presence of each other. So some of these conversations will need to be cross-county conversations. And I think they can be potentially challenging conversations to have. But if you start with that point of empathy with whoever the storyteller is, and then move out from that to like, what implications does this have for my life? We're hoping that stories will soften people up and make them more willing to be in relationship with each other, such that the question about like Gary isn't a question only of Gary, but it's a question for the region. Like our well-being as a region has to do with the lives of each other instead of just by my township or my city. So that doesn't solve like economic problems directly,
well,
but
it could
lead
depending
to...
on how you decide to edit this, because if your editing is primarily, the goal is to soften the story up, you might want to be careful how someone describes their white flight, or you might want to be careful about how someone describes the racism of the layoffs and the police and the housing conditions in Gary. And if you want to soften the story up, is there a tendency to make sure that those things...
I don't want to soften the story.
Oh, okay. I have misunderstood when you said... You said soft, okay.
But you're right, because
Because if I say, right, I didn't want to live next to him anyway because he was racist to his bone. His son was a cop and he shot my kid.
Yeah.
Now you interview that and you put that on and you show it to this guy's relatives next door.
Yeah.
I don't know if the first response would be softening.
No, thank you. That's true. And I feel like, yes, conflict, you have to go through conflict. So I appreciate that, because it won't be, I don't foresee this being a magical experience.
The other question I have, if I can just keep pushing this for a minute, is some of the things go beyond the personal experience, the story that I have. Because the reason there were 27,000 people laid off and most of them were black was not because of the guy next door, but because of U.S. Steel's shareholders that wanted to secure a profit at the expense of the number of people that were employed. Now that really would be a targeted function of an interview.
Yes.
But if somebody doesn't say that or articulate that, it would seem to me we would continue in the realm of, oh, I miss you, you were a good neighbor, or I miss that neighborhood, rather than focusing on a change that could actually give a rebirth to Gary, which would have to change the economics. I don't know if that's too polemical here, but...
No, I mean, I think one of the things we've struggled with is how do you take a story from conversation, so we can talk about it, and that's nice and fine, but then how do you move to action? Yes. And that's always been, I think, a struggle with storytelling, is the action piece. But one of the things that we want to do with this expansion is, so we have a team that crosses over to IUN and a number of other, IUPUI, to look at, okay, what are the historical significances that were going on? What are the economic changes that happened? What policies are enforced that create this separation between the counties instead of a sense of interconnectedness?
Even how Gary was founded and developed. Yeah.
So it is part of a bigger picture. I think the stories work in one way, but they don't do the whole. They won't fix it.
It's a means for extending the conversation.
Yeah.
It's a means for softening up people to have the conversation, whether the interviews themselves are soft or not.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
I think it also makes it easier to start understanding how complex the situation is, and maybe more interesting to the layperson. So, well, actually to anyone, right? I love the story. That's where my heart is. So will I look at this historical document or will I watch the story? Well, first I'll watch the story, and that might take me to the document.
I enjoy that. I appreciate that. I think a story's an entryway. I'm just pleased to see that the Welcome Project seems to go beyond the story, because too often it strikes me that the story becomes the everything, but you go beyond. And I would suggest there is one action everybody could take, which is the website, which is what again?
Welcomeproject.valpo.edu.
Welcomeproject.valpo.edu. Thank you. That's all the time we have for today. This was our last show of the season, so I'm very happy to end with you two as my guest. Perhaps Purdue Calumet could become part of your network in the not too distant
Fantastic.
future.
Love that.
It's all the time we have on the program. Thank you for joining me, Lee Artz. I'm your host for the final episode of Calumet Roundtable 2015. Have a great season. Thank you.